All right, we ended last time with entitlement consultant. Can you kind of give us a wrap up and up to speed of why we're on this slide here and, a little bit, Scott?
Entitlement consultant is almost what I do when I do it for other people. So what we pretty much do as an entitlement or development consultant, a lot of times we call it a development consultant, is we put together the team, all the different people that we talked about last time: geotech, landscape, civil engineer, architects if necessary, surveyors, soil testers, geotech, environmental, etc. And then we'll run through the process. So typically we'll look at the application. Everybody's different. And, again, I'm more Florida oriented, so my expertise is in Florida. But we have two things here. We have zoning and future land use. Those two have to be compatible in order to have development. So when we change the future land use, then we change the zoning. And a lot of times, the future land use is something that we can work with, and then we just get it rezoned. If we have a future land use, if we have to change the future land use and change the zoning, depending on the size of it and where it is, it may add 3 to 6 months extra on the approval process. Like a little town where Robbins has the offices, Apopka. You can't do the zoning in Apopka until you change the future land use. So it's 3 to 6 months, and then you can start the zoning process. So we'll usually go through the application almost in every instance. The city or municipality, county, whatever, is going to require an up-to-date survey. So one of the first things that we always seem to do is get a boundary survey on the property. If the owner has one, then we can get that updated. That saves us a lot of time and some money. And then we'll go through our initial due diligence, which is going to the utility department, find out what the water, sewer, et cetera is. Most places have electric, so we're not too concerned about electric. Then we'll go to the building department and see if they have anything special. If there's going to be well and septic, we need to talk to the health department. And then highway and roads, if necessary, for what we call driveway permits. We're working on a little deal right now that I'm doing with the Sharing Center, which is an organization in Longwood that helps homeless people. We have a little triangular piece of property that's 750 feet of frontage on a 4-lane divided highway. It has a median cut, which is nice, but it requires that the entrance be 300 feet away from either of the two streets on either side. So it was perfect because we have 750 feet, but that directed where we had to put the entrance to the site. So we couldn't go closer to one street or the other street. We just had to put it in the middle. So that's usually a due diligence item we'll check on. And then stormwater management, we need to figure out whether or not we have which Florida stormwater group, either St. John's River Water Management District, Southwest Florida Water Management District, et cetera. And then we would add in here Florida Fish and Wildlife Service and the which is pretty much handling all the bugs and bunnies and the endangered species.
Hey, Scott.
Cool.
Yo.
Ron wants to know how old is considered a recent survey?
I think they're all different. A lot of times it's usually within a year. If you have a survey, a lot of times you can just go to the survey company and let's say it was 6 years, 5 years, 3 years old or whatever, and they'll just recertify it for a nominal fee. If not, you'll have to get a boundary. I'm working on a 32-acre mixed-use project in a little town called Deltona, which is in Volusia County. It's the next county, 2 counties north of Orlando. And it took me almost 5 months to get the survey. So that was on 30 acres. So that was a little bit of an anomaly. Now it's easing up a little bit and it's quicker. And if you're doing a small project, it's a different survey company typically that will do a small project, at least here, then we'll do the big projects. So I have a lot of guys, or a really good company that does individual lot surveys up to 3 to 5 acres, and they can go out and they can get usually that done in a couple of weeks. Once you start getting the bigger ones, a lot of the small companies don't want to do the bigger ones. So again, depending on what you're doing, you may want to, that's a key thing that we always look at very, very early in the process. Because if it's going to take me 3 months to get the survey, I think I want to factor that into my contract with the sellers.
Yeah, and that's something to keep in mind when we get into contracts. A little bit later on today, we're going to get into that kind of stuff, but yeah, factor in the time frame for a survey and other due diligence things that you want to get done. All right, on this slide, we're talking about the financial side of things, and you know, there's you probably can chime in on some of this too, Scott, but obviously, you know, it's good to have a CPA to kind of guide you through when you're developing your, especially on larger projects, you know, a financial plan, especially if you're going to get some private money or some lenders involved. But you have some sources, could be the mortgage lenders, you know, the regular banks and that kind of stuff. You can get mortgages on raw land. It's a little more difficult, but it can be done. But a lot of times when you're doing a development, you're looking at private and angel investors because they're the ones that are willing to take the risk on a project where other lenders will not. And then we'll talk about some seller and owner financing when we get into contracts. And what's a community land trust, Scott?
Florida has a thing called the community land trust, where the community land trust will go in and buy the land, and then they lease it back to the owners. It's typically an affordable housing type of financing vehicle. And the counties generally have to approve the use of a community land trust. We have a group here that's very active throughout the Central Florida band, if you will. And it's really kind of neat because if I'm looking at, let's say my land is nearly 400,000 for our first little deal. And if they came in and wrote that check for 400, and it's they lease it back on a 99-year basis with a renewable for another 99 years.
Wow.
So they have some caveats in that, but that's kind of a neat deal. So in terms of what the cost to your, either the project for a rental or the project if it's a for sale project, that's a big help, because that's a very nominal payment in terms of paying it back.
Yeah, and we'll talk about, you know, the risks in that a little bit, but in the community land trust, don't you have to agree to do affordable housing and certain rent type things that in order to get that kind of purchase from a community land trust?
Yeah, there's this, they call it sustainability. So what you'll have to do is when, let's say if I'm selling my units, then it would have to be sold to someone who is also in that same income bracket that originally bought it. So let's say you're in the moderate income at 80% of median income. You know, the house can go up 100,000, but whoever buys it has to be in that 80% of median income bracket. So there's usually a deed restriction in there that would caveat that.
Right. Okay, so you have to basically, it's the government trying to help you out to do this development, but they want some things back from it, and one of them is that you're going to be able to provide some affordable housing to the low to moderate income by purchaser.
Yeah, and again, the term that you would want to use in terms of talking with anyone is sustainability.
Sustainability.
The sustainability is a really big buzzword right now, at least around here.
You know, let's talk about that for a second before we go on. I think that's important. I hear that buzzword all the time, sustainability. For me, that means that, you know, I'm building sustainable housing, or I'm using, you know, what does it mean that when you say sustainable? What is that? Can you define that?
In terms of the attainable or affordable housing arena, and last week we talked about affordable being attainable. A lot of our government people are getting away from the word affordable because there's a connotation of crime
Subsidy.
and lower, yeah, subsidy, it doesn't have a good ring to it. Where attainable or workforce and attainable, everybody seems to really like that. The sustainability means is that they want to ensure that if they're giving financial dollars, whether it be impact fee credits or just a grant or whatever the government is giving, that when that unit is sold, it's the best example I could give is we've had some incredible rises, and I guess most of the country has, in terms of the housing value. So a house that was worth 200 grand a couple of years ago, it's worth 400,000 now. They don't want that affordable housing person to go ahead and come in and buy the house and then sell it, make 200 grand and move on. So they want to make sure that when it's resold, that money, that it's sold to somebody who's also in the attainable workforce or affordable housing community in terms of their income. We have a number of different things in Florida. There's SHIP money, the State Housing Initiative Partnership money, which comes out of we have a documentary state stamp tax on the sale of all the properties in Florida. That money goes into a pot, and the state's been pirating that fund for years and years and years. They raise a couple $100 million and they go take 200 or 180 out of it and leave 20 million to go to the affordable housing, and they take 180, and then they finally approved last year, starting next year in 2023, where they're not going to be able to rob that fund anymore. It's going to go to affordable housing, and every county has a certain criteria of how to split up the amount of SHIP funds that come in. But some of that's been a $10,000 down payment assistance, which is again sustainable. But if you keep the house for 10 years, it's forgivable. But if you sell it, the house, you have to pay it back.
Got it.
Sell it within the 10 years. So, if you make 20 or 50 grand or whatever on your house, you got to pay that $10,000. They call it a soft second. But that's a lot of times the down payment necessary for someone to actually get into the home.
Cool. Very good. Very good.
One thing I need to mention is you mentioned about mortgage or financial companies, banks or whatever, coming in and financing land. It's rare right now to see bank financing at more than 50% of the value of the land. So if your land is 400,000, the chances are you're only going to be able to borrow 200. And a lot of times they're not going to loan it to you until you have the entitlements.
Right. Makes sense.
And there's another slide we have coming up where we're going to talk about that risk reward. So I'll wait until then.
All right. So obviously, when you're doing any kind of business, there's the insurance agent that's involved, and bonds. Basically, they have performance bonds and different kinds of bonds that you sometimes have to put up in order to guarantee that certain things are going to get done. The Villages sells bonds, believe it or not. When you buy a house, you have a bond on your house. Might be $30,000, and that's for the infrastructure. That was kind of an interesting way that they developed the Villages.
That's the thing. Let me talk about that a little bit if you want.
Sure.
That's a thing called the Community Development District, which allows for a developer to go ahead and sell bonds to raise money to pay for the infrastructure, which would be your streets, your drainage systems, lighting, street lighting, sidewalks, all those kind of things. Typically, it only works if you have a very large development. Right. And because of the cost, it's a significant cost to getting it. And then what happens is the individual property owners have an annual assessment that goes on their tax bill. So it's paid back over the course of 20 or 30 years, or whatever the term of the bond, through the payment of property taxes.
Yeah, so that's really, obviously we're talking about, developing, 30 tiny houses at a time. But, you know, if you get into a big development, you know, it might be a strategy that you'd want to use in order to pay for the golf courses and the swimming pools and the common areas and all of that. That's going to really help pay for the development of that a tiny house community.
You got to be up in the 10, 12, $15 million range of infrastructure in order to make that work. Because I worked on a project in St. Cloud, and we talked to both the financial guy and the guy who would be the manager of the bonds. So the underwriter, we talked to both of them, and we were at about 10 to 12 million on the infrastructure, and that was kind of the bottom end of what they thought would work from a financial perspective.
Yeah. And, you know, 10 or 12 million these days isn't a whole lot when you get right down to it, if you're doing a large project. And then general liability, obviously everybody knows what kind of, you know, what that is. Usually when you have a, for instance, when you have a development and you're renting out units or you're doing Airbnb or whatever, you need to have a liability policy on your common areas. If somebody gets hurt there, that you're not liable for that. And then workers' comp, not only on your maintenance guys, but make sure that when we get into you know, the construction workers there that actually do the work, that they are workman's comp or workman's comp exempt.
That's really important when you have, let's say you're going to do a 30-unit project where you're hiring ABC Construction as your general contractor. You need to make sure that they are requiring all their subcontractors to have workers' comp.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because if you're not, if you're not and somebody gets hurt, it's the landowner that gets sued. They're the ones that are culpable and liable. And you know, that's why when you do get a building permit, it's a thing called a notice of commencement. You have to file a notice of commencement with the county, which tells the world, hey, I am starting a job here, and all of your material suppliers. I know Cemex used to be the worst one. They will send a lien potential lien paper out to the homeowners that you pour concrete at, and they're going to say, what, are you putting a lien on my property? No, but if they don't get paid, if it's a charge account and they don't get paid, they can put a lien on the property. And that's why all the notice of commencements are out there, is who do you send this lien document to? And that's
and the other thing that goes along with that is when, let's say, the bank pays you a draw, which is part of the cost of the construction, and you pay it to Cemex or, you know, ABC Construction or whoever you pay it to, you need to make sure that there's a paper trail of what they call lien releases. So as you pay Cemex or you pay, you know, Billy Bob's Window Company for 30 units worth of windows or 10 units worth of windows, and you still got 20 to go, then they have what they call partial releases. So you want to make sure that all of that's accounted for. Because if not, Billy Bob's Window could come after you later.
Yeah.
And so you want to make sure that ABC pays Billy Bob.
All right. This is the last slide of the last weeks that we did, horizontal and vertical construction. Can you define horizontal and vertical construction for us again, Scott?
Sure. You're going to have an architect coming in on the vertical, and a lot of times they'll use draftsmen to do some of the layouts, but you're going to need signed and sealed plans, and that's where the architect comes in. And then if you're on this, the civil engineer is typically the horizontal guy. The mechanical engineer will do what they call the MEPs, the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing drawings. So a lot of times the architect may sub those drawings out to a mechanical engineer or a draftsman through the mechanical engineer. The difference between the civil and the mechanical is the civil is usually just purely horizontal. They're doing the roads, utilities, underground utilities, street lighting, sidewalks, all those things.
So when we're talking horizontal, we're talking the roads, the street lights, the underground utilities, and that's horizontal construction. Vertical construction is you pour a foundation and build a structure up from the raw land. Is that what we're saying?
Yes, sir. And typically, if I'm doing a subdivision, I'm going to have a site contractor, and then I'm selling lots to somebody. If I'm doing it as a consistent project, like what we're talking about doing on our DreamQuest tiny neighborhoods, where the parking is external and not as an interior street, the general contract would typically control the site contractor in that instance. So there's different applications depending on what you're doing in terms of what your project is. The nice thing about having the GC, the general contractor, controlling everything is you only have one point of contact. You don't have people pointing fingers at each other, like saying, well, you were supposed to do that. No, you were supposed to do that, et cetera, go back and forth on all of that.
And the unnice thing about it is you have to pay the general contractor, whereas if you were handling the different things yourself, you could cut that guy out. On a smaller project, you may want to be your own project manager rather than having a GC. If you have that, then you basically are acting as a general contractor, hiring the subs, doing all the legwork that would get involved with that.
We call that boutiquing, and it depends on who your general contractor is. So we're going to have a general contractor that's going to do our vertical, but we're going to work very closely with him and probably boutique out a lot of the horizontal, because the paving is almost always done by a paving company. Rarely does anybody else do the paving. So I'm not sure that I want to pay my GC a 15% markup to handle the paving. I may pay them a 5% markup to go ahead and coordinate the paving, through somebody that we pick, because, we're doing a small parking lot area on our projects, and on smaller deals like that, like clearing, I don't need to have the GC cleared. I can clear that before the GC gets started. And so I may be able to save significant dollars. I may even be able to call a tree guy to come in and take the trees out. If there's substantial trees, most of them are just going to chop the trees off and leave the roots. But then site guy, the horizontal guy, comes in and he's popping the roots out. It's a lot easier when he can just move through the site, scoop the roots out, when he doesn't have to worry about, the foliage and the trees all being in the way and everything. So there's different ways you can save some dollars if you're creative in the applications that what you're going to do.
Yeah, and that's really up to you, whether you have the time and expertise to manage something like that, or whether you would be better off letting a general contractor handle it all.
The other thing is just purely the size. Size. A bigger project, you're going to get a site guy to do the whole thing.
Right, exactly. All right, well, before we move on, this is a good stopping point to ask any questions on what we just covered, those 4 slides, because we're going to move into a different topic here regarding the purchase of the raw land. If not, then let's roll. Getting to the starting line, and I wrote this because, we haven't even gotten to the starting line. We've got a lot of work to do before we can turn over the first shovel of dirt. And there's a lot of stuff to get to. And, there's contracts, there's due diligence, there's permits, and there's other approvals. And so we're going to focus on the contracts for the next few minutes. This is the most risky part of everything, because it's possible to get to the end of all of this due diligence and have a roadblock that you just can't overcome. And all of the deposits, if they've gone hard, and all of the due diligence that you've done basically is lost at that point. We may be able to recoup some, but this is the most risky part of everything. And the thing is, we're going to talk about, what could possibly go wrong. But you know, that's what we're going to be doing in some of these slides right here. But the point I'm trying to make is the investors that you get, these angel investors and private investors, they want a pretty big chunk. If they're going to be putting their money out there to support this project that you're working on, they're going to want percentage-wise a pretty good ROI or a portion of the project in order to put out the money, $300,000-$400,000 that could be at risk. And when I talk a pretty good chunk, what do you think, Scott, these angel investors would be looking for an ROI?
Well, I think let's take a typical deal. We're working on this one for the sharing center that's going to be 80 units. There's about call it 6 acres of land, just to make it simple. And those are going to be 2-story apartment units, and there's 2 different pieces of property. So we just got our engineering gave us a proposal for a civil engineer, gave us a proposal for the first piece of property, which was for 40 units, and then he just re-upped it for the 80 units. So that's coming in at about 80 grand. So it's close to 1,000. It's 80, actually 82,000. Plus he had another 12,000 in for permitting fees, and then later on another 10,000 for construction administration. So if I go and I look at the very initial dollars that I spend, I'm going to have an initial deposit. We try not to give any more than 5 grand as an initial deposit. And that usually does not go hard, which means at risk, until we get to some watershed event, which is like a zoning or something like that. So, or it could be just through a due diligence period where we feel pretty comfortable that we could move forward with it. So if it's already zoned and the future land use is compatible and it's got utilities out there, et cetera, in 3 months or 2 to 3 months, we'd have a 60 to 90 day due diligence period, and then we could put money at risk subject to seller's title, and then moving forward, because we don't really have any permit risk issues there. If we have to get rezoned and change the future land use, now we have some more serious dollars. So we told the sharing center yesterday, they're going to spend 20 to 25 grand to get us to the point that they know that they can do the project. Okay. So that's kind of our rough estimate, not including deposit money, because the deposit money would be refundable to the extent of not getting the zoning. If we don't get the zoning,
so they're willing to put 25 grand at risk at that point.
At that point,
that would be lost money if it doesn't go through, but the 5 grand would come back. Well, yeah, and what I heard is an investor, a angel investor, they're looking for 20%, 25% return on their money if they fund everything or put funds into a project. So that's pretty high return on investment for somebody, but the risk is high, and you really don't have that money out of your pocket. So they are due something like that. It's better if you can figure out how to do it without the angel investor, but if you have to use one, that's what you're going to be looking at.
So on our Dream Quest, let me go to there. So on Dream Quest, we're paying 70% to the angel investors for the first deal. That's going to come out because we're going to be able to mark the land up once it's entitled. We're going to spend about 100 grand. We're going to mark it up about 150 to put it into the moving forward after it gets entitled. So we'll be able to pay most of that back to the investors to get the first deal going. But we're a startup, it's a nonprofit, and we theoretically don't have, while I have an extensive background in land development, and my partner Eric has got an extensive background in building construction, and but we haven't done a tiny house community yet. So everybody's kind of looking at this first one going, it's super high risk as far as they're concerned for the entitlement process. The second
so you're
deal
saying it's 70, did you say it's 70% is what the angel investor wants?
We're paying a 70% return for the first one, yes.
But
and then
I don't know what that means.
So if you put up 100 grand, you're going to get 170 back in 18 months. 14 to
18,
18.
okay, got it, got it. That makes sense. I understand
So-
that. And those numbers work for you, right? Paying him
Yeah,
107?
we're really not too happy about it, but our goal is to do 2,000 of these in the next 3 years. So if we
Okay.
have to give away too much for the first couple, we think that that's building for the future, and that all those people, when we give them the money back, they'll give us their money back again to do it again.
So that's what you have to pay because it's such a high risk project, 70%.
Right. Now, what you can do is you can go to friends, family, other people that you may know as angel investors, et cetera, and pay less. Very few investors that are going into what this is considered to be the highest risk part, because this is just toss away money, the beginning money, is between 20 and 25% is where most investors want to be. We find 15 to 18 is kind of on the low side. 18 to 22 to 25 is really good. And once you start offering more than 25, I think something's wrong with it. So it's really kind of an interesting thing. Ours is a little different because we have kind of a business plan, and we're going out, and we just cut the attorney loose to do what they call a Reg 8D, Regulation 8D as in dog, private placement documents. So
Right, to gather money from accredited investors.
Correct. So, we're going to 30,000 feet and looking at this, and we're paying more, but we're trying to raise enough money to do the first 3 projects. And we've raised 150 so far. We've collected 85 in the last 3 weeks. We're still getting more to collect, and then we've got a bunch more coming in next week. I know, or 2 weeks from now, guys, but 50. So,
Yeah. So just guys, so that I can kind of interpret what I'm sure it's sounding like, what the heck are they talking about? When you buy a house, you're going to be paying, now it's around 7% interest. But if you're going to do a high risk thing, it's going to be around 20%. But if it's a real high risk, like Scott's talking about, he's paying 70% return over 18 months, which if you divide that out by 1.5, or 12 months, how much it would be, it's going to work out to about 48% per annum return that this guy's getting on his money. So, all right. Market research. We talked a little bit about Zillow and LoopNet and all of those. So we don't have to go too much into all of those. When we talk about paid data, what are we paying for when we're looking for paid data?
There's sites that'll provide, just like if you were investing in houses, you can pay services to provide leads for you. I don't think I've ever paid for data to buy land to do a development.
We've done one thing as NOAA. There was a research project of what is the projection over the next 5 years for tiny houses on wheels. And so we paid for that data so that we could tell whether, our project, we didn't do it for this reason, but you could get that data and pay for it to see if, your project that you're working on is really a viable option for you or not. You can pay for this data from a research college or whatever. And then you can look at it and say, well, it looks like, in this area or in this state or wherever we're developing, that there's going to be so many people moving in, that this is their income. It's pages and pages of documents, but it's really in your due diligence. If you're doing a big project, it's probably a well-spent money if you're trying to figure out whether to go or not to go.
The beauty of paid data in terms of market research, one of my best friends does about 30 or 40% of the apartment studies in Greater Orlando. And he charges 10 grand. He'll do a mini study for 5 grand. And what it does is it gives you third-party endorsement to your project. It's not you saying that. You can point out to somebody over here, and they're blessing what you're doing. The other thing that happens in the first couple of projects that you do in terms of development, and we'll get into this in another another session, but is the financial pro forma is a very different one than everybody's used to seeing because your construction cycle is so quick. So my 22 houses, I have 8 to 12 months of spending the 100 to 150 grand total to get the whole thing permitted. Because we didn't really talk about that. I said the 25, the sharing centers, but we told them once we kick the engineer loose, once it's zoned, we kick the engineer loose, they're going to have probably close to 150 grand in to get all the permits necessary to actually build the project.
But at that point, it's pretty good to go. You're not, they're not losing money at that. They're not going to risk money at that point.
At that point, you're not spending money that would be toss away because you're going to be able to do the project.
Okay.
But what kind of gets interesting is you have a long lead time on your zoning. And then once we get to the point where we can actually start the construction, I'm doing a little, 2-3 acre project. I can clear that in a week, and I can get the first house pads ready in 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and then we're going around in a circle. And so a crew doing the foundation staking for a 400 square foot house could do 2 of those a day. And then, so we've been talking with the concrete guys, they're going to come in and pour a bunch of houses, in the same day. So it's really going to be fast. So what happens is you get this rocket up all of a sudden, and then you're selling. And as soon as you sell, your need for cash goes back down. So our whole project is close to $5 million of need. And we're projecting that we're going to be out 2.2 to 2.5, 2.2 million to 2.5 million. And then the sale money is going to bring the dollars back, and we won't really need the other 2.5 million. It's really, it's a very interesting pro forma. And so most investor people, that's the other thing, is they're not used to seeing it. So our whole thing is to get 2 projects in the ground so we can show everybody how these numbers worked, and then go for the bigger money.
Yeah, I think what we can do probably, Scott, is spend one evening on just the pro forma, the understanding how it works, why it works this way, and what are the numbers going to look like. And we'll do, an example of what that pro forma would look like on an actual project. When I wrote down on your own research, driving the area, what does that mean?
We would typically, for our project, we were looking for a small piece of property on a main road that had public transportation, that was close to employment centers. So I found a neat little property up in DeLand that met all that. It was in Volusia County, unincorporated county, and I was working with the county, so the government was real familiar. And there's utilities there. It's on a 4-lane divided road, etc. And it's 2.6 miles to a super Walmart, which is right next to a Lowe's and a big public center. It's 4 miles to Stetson University and 5 miles to downtown DeLand, where the Volusia County government is. It's also 3.4 miles to a big hospital. So and it's on public transportation. So it had a lot of these the criteria that I was looking for, because you can't go doing one of these projects out in the boonies if you're doing a development, because you need water and sewer, et cetera, and you need public transportation and those kind of things in order to get the government support in our instance. So that's all part of my criteria.
Okay, so that's the when you find a piece of property that you like, and you get in your car and you drive around the neighborhood, you see what it looks like, you see what's close by, what's not close by, you look on Google Maps, and you do some of your own research that way to determine whether or not this is going to work for you or not.
Yeah, there's a little town over in Brevard County, which is just south of where all the space stuff is, called Rockledge. Rockledge was one of the first communities in Central Florida, or in Florida, that passed a tiny house ordinance. So I went and I set up a meeting with the head of planning and zoning and the city manager, and sat down with them and said, we want to do tiny houses and you all, started this. Where should we go? So they pointed me over to a road called US 1, which is a major north-south that goes from, the Keys up to Maine. And so they pointed to that area and said, go find property between this street and this street, which was a couple miles along US 1. And they said, go in there, and that would be your best. We had a couple other sites that we were talking to them about. And they said, well, we don't think we can approve this. We don't think we can approve that. But if you go over here, that would be a great place and we can get it approved for sure. So that pointed us to an area. And then you just drive up and down the road, look at signs, and then send letters to people that are property owners. I go into the property appraisers, pull up all the owners, and then just send them a simple letter saying, we'd like to buy your property. Are you interested in selling?
Perfect. Perfect. What kind of market research can you do on the MLS?
MLS is good because it gives you comps. So some of the land is listed, some of it isn't. Typically, when you get into land brokerage, you get into the more commercial type of brokers that are more sophisticated. Then I call them Holly Homemaker real estate agent, who is primarily a house seller, and then she's going to list property that Leanne's family has owned for 40 years. She doesn't know anything about it, and so typically we would know a lot more about it than they do. So we have to be a little careful dealing with them. But MLS provides us with leads. It also shows you other land that's available in it and around that area. And then you can search comps and then pending sales too.
Perfect.
And then watch the pendings until they're sold, and then you can figure out what they actually sold for. That's what we use MLS for. And I am a realtor.
And then just the point is to have most of your due diligence done prior to your going hard. You talked about they're willing to have 25,000 at risk before they go hard on it, but we're going to go a little bit deeper into the contracts and the types and that kind of thing. But the point is that do as much free research and stuff that you can do that doesn't cost a whole lot prior, and then get as much of your due diligence done so that you can, once you go hard, whatever you have down at that point, whatever you spent at that point is at risk. So the first step after you, go ahead.
Let me just interject here. Some of the very initial things that goes right along with what you just said is like your utilities. You can pick up the phone and the properties, let's say in Orange County or whatever. You can pick up the phone and call the utility department. They'll usually either send you a map show you where the water and sewer are or whatever, or they'll tell you on the phone. And the same thing with zoning. So all you need is a parcel ID number, which we have all our pieces of property here have a parcel ID number. And we just call the zoning department and say, I got this parcel. What can I do with it? I mean, I'm as simple as it comes in terms of, I don't get sophisticated with them. I just say, what can I do with it? What's its own and what's the future land use? Because those are our two things here. And they'll pretty much typically spend 5 or 10 minutes talking with you. And, the zoning people don't know anything about utilities. Utility people don't know anything about zoning. And so you just kind of have to stick within the realm of who you're talking to. So, you say, I want to do tiny houses there. What do you think? And they'll throw the phone at you, or they'll say, no, you can't do that. And you say, well, how about, what can I do it if I do this? And then a lot of times, if you show them respect, it's kind of like getting stopped by a police officer. If you're a real jerk when you talk to the police officer, you're going to get 5 tickets. A lot of times when you're really nice to them and you respect them and everything like that, it may get you off with a warning. So same thing happens with the people in the utility department of planning and zoning. I talk to people all day long. And a lot of people are like really jerks when they talk to them. And I like to, hey, Robin, how are you doing today? You having a good day? I got this little piece of property over here. I'm not sure what I can do with it. Can you help me out? And you start to have that kind of attitude, then all of a sudden you're different than the other 54 calls that they've had that morning. And then they say, okay, yeah. And then you say, okay, here, and it's on this road, and it's got this frontage, and say, oh yeah, okay. And then so I try to be interested in what they're telling me, and that usually goes a long way. But when you can have a lot of that stuff done, and so you know that you have to rezone it, let's say, and that right now in the city of Deltona, they're taking 8 to 12 months on rezoning because they got short staffed and they got all these projects. Or they say, yeah, it's a breeze. That one we can breeze through in 3 months, no problem. This is what you have to do that. And a lot of times they'll tell you all that stuff, and then they'll point you to the website, or they'll send you the list of the stuff that you need to do, like the survey, and what do we need to do for this, and here's the application, and here's the fees, and all that stuff.
So there's a lot of stuff you can get done on your own if you are willing to make a couple of phone calls that may not be exact or perfect, but it certainly gives you a good idea, a good feel for whether this is going to be a project you want to spend some time on.
Yeah, we typically don't spend a whole lot of time on stuff that's going to be very, very difficult to get approved. There's just too many pieces of property around. Polk County, I called them several times. I've done a bunch of projects in Polk County, and I said, I want to do some tiny houses. And the first 4 people I talked to said, we don't approve tiny houses. We don't allow them,
Right.
And then
right.
So you got to keep calling back until you talk to the right person who says, well, we might be able to do that if you did this. If you did a planned development, they said, for $100, you could do a sketch and come in and do a pre-app, and then we could talk about it. So you do a simple sketch and pay your $100 and schedule, in 2 or 3 weeks from now, they have a meeting, and they're all doing them by Zoom calls now. And they get the utility people and the fire department and the police and everybody in there to talk about your little project. And,
guys, this information that Scott's sharing with you is invaluable. I mean, he's saving you, weeks and months of time cutting through stuff that, not having to figure out what you don't know what you don't know. And Scott is just sharing with us some of the shortcuts that we can do, that you can do in your tiny house project to make it happen, make it work, make it viable. So you don't get discouraged. You don't run up against a brick wall. So yeah, listen to that. That's some good advice. Thank you, Scott. All right. Here's a question for you. Do we have to sign something in the real estate world?
Yeah, I always, in Florida, we like to have verbal written contracts. I use, and we talked about this last week, I use the standard FAR/BAR contract and then a 3-page addendum. But when I get the contract signed, I find out prior to getting the contract signed, one of the questions I ask the government is, do I need a seller's authorization? And you always need a seller's authorization. We used to be able to get away with the blanket one. It just says, Mr. Butler will give Banta permission to apply for all these permits and everything. Now, all the cities and counties are requiring their own. So what I do is I make a general one, and I get the form from the county or the city. And then when I go to Mr. Butler and present my contract, at that point, everybody's all friendly. Everything's really nice. And so Mr. Butler has no problem signing those 2 authorization forms for me, allowing me to go get his property rezoned.
What Scott's talking about here is, in other words, you're going to try to go get some permits, but you can't get a permit until you own the property. But hey, we want to go get the permit before we own the property. So as soon as we close, as soon as we put the money down, we can really start getting busy work on this. And so that's a strategy right there to hang on to, that get a seller's authorization that will give you the right to get the permits for the property before you have to close.
Yeah, we're doing that before we close, not after.
Yeah, because after you close, you don't need a seller's authorization because you are the owner of the property.
Right.
But in most states, a real estate transaction has to be in writing. It can be on a napkin. I'm going to sell you my house for $50,000, and everybody signs it. At least you've got a contract and it's in writing. Of course, there's a lot of stuff that you need with that, but rule of thumb is whatever you guys agree on, and we're going to get into some different ones, letters of intent here in a minute, and contracts for deeds and contracts and options and all that, but they all have to be in writing. It's easy to forget what you said, a month ago or 3 months ago when it's time to close if you don't have it already spelled out in writing in some form.
It really only has to be in writing in Florida to be enforceable.
Right. That's
So
that's a good point. That's a good point. Enforceable, meaning that if it's an oral contract and the person comes to the closing and he signs everything, you give him the money and it's all done, that's fine. But if he says, no, I'm not going to sell you this property, and it was just an oral contract, then you can't enforce that. Is that right?
Well, the other thing is just the terms and conditions can change. It's like, yeah, I was going to sell you that, but you were going to close in 2 weeks. I didn't understand that about you need to get permits or whatever. I don't really care about whether you have permits or not. I just want my money. A lot of older, we get a lot of old farmer people, and they don't care whether it's wet, dry, up or down, or environmentally sensitive, or there's a bunny on it or anything like that. They don't care about any of that shit. They just want my money.
Right. Right. So anyway, if you're working with a farmer, and you do an oral contract, beware, you may have some issues when you go try to close. But the best thing to do is to have a meeting of the minds where everything's put down on paper and it's in writing, and no one has any questions when it comes time to close. All right. Who do you need in order to get to a contract? What people?
But we talked about it last week some, but we can talk about it more here, which is you can have a real estate broker or an acquisition person or just yourself. I am a broker, but I typically do all my own. Once in a while, I'll let somebody else handle it for me if there's some specific reason to. And then sometimes you can use a real estate attorney. We usually use the attorney just to help with permitting in certain instances. Certain places we don't use them, and certain places we do. In Florida, we use a lot of title companies to close property rather than attorneys. I find that the key thing about if you're going to deal with an attorney is that you want a deal attorney. I'm just working on my big mixed-use project in Deltona, and we have this gal who's representing my partner, and she's just not that experienced in real estate. And she's gotten in the way more than she's solved stuff. So we're having to kind of educate her so that she can solve stuff. And so that's kind of a thing. The title companies they're good at closing stuff, and then they're good at finding the title things that you need to know. I like to get municipal lien searches, and then there's usually a survey exception in your title policy. If you get the survey up front and you have a preliminary title policy pulled as soon after you get the contract for your property, you can have the surveyor put that stuff from the title company on the survey, and then you can eliminate the survey exception later on when you close on your title policy, Schedule B2.
Do you get a title insurance on all your closings?
All my land development deals, yes.
In other words, guys, you don't have to necessarily have title insurance if there's not a mortgage involved. If you're paying cash for something, you can buy things without having the title insurance. However, I think it's a good idea on every closing to have title insurance to be sure that there's not some problems with the title when you go to sell it later on.
We did a bunch of cheap mobile homes on tax deeds, and none of those did we ever get title insurance. And I did all my own title searches. Once in a while, I'd call my title buddy and have him pull a $75 search for me, but most of the time I just did it myself.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I had one where in Miami where there was, we did a closing and I got title insurance on it. And then I put it into a land trust with 7 partners. And we found a $15,000 mortgage that the title insurance company missed. And they covered the title insurance on my portion, but the other 6 people, they didn't cover that because I transferred it from me to the land trust with 7 partners. So,
And you didn't retitle insurance when you did the transfer, right?
correct.
Sometimes we'll do that, but if we have a curiosity, you know, sometimes if I buy something from like on a tax deed, as soon as I get it, I'll transfer the title to somebody else to avoid some of those issues.
And
But
then,
that's a specialized thing. So
yeah. And then if you're doing something different, something odd, there's some terms and conditions with the buyer that the FAR contract or a standard raw land contract doesn't have in it. You may need a real estate attorney to produce either the contract or an addendum to the contract to specifically spell out the terms and conditions that you're going to have. So if, in other words, if you're going to have multiple deposits at different milestones, you may want to have that spelled out in an addendum to the contract or something like that.
we do that in our 3-page addendum. We
Okay.
show all the watershed events.
Okay. All right. And then you don't have to have an attorney unless you want an attorney to come up with the terms of the verbiage that you want to have.
That the 3-page addendum that we use was written by an attorney here, and I've been using it for 30 years. So I mean, it really hasn't changed, and it's really simple, and it becomes fill in the blank. It's you can almost highlight in yellow and hand it to somebody, and it's a fill in the blank thing. On the bigger deals, we always start with an LOI, a letter of intent. It's usually a 2-page thing. Try not to get it any more than 2 pages. And basically what it does is sets out the buyer or seller in your general terms. You know, I'm going to put up a $5,000 deposit. I'm going to get the property rezoned, and I'm giving myself 6 months to get it zoned. And as soon as it's zoned, I'm going to deposit another 20 grand. That whole 25 now is at risk. And then I'm going to close in a year when I have all my permits. And we're going to close for cash, and the buyer is such and such, and I have the right to assign it to another entity, because we rarely ever close in whatever we contract for. So like my Deltona deal was started out as 20 acres. So I called it Normandy 20 LLC, and it's going to not close in Normandy 20. It's going to close in a new partnership name or a new LLC name. So that's pretty normal. We then move, usually once everybody agrees on.
Let me comment on that for a second, real quick, Scott. I think what he just said was like gold, guys. What he said was just gold. We get the LOI, or maybe if it, you can also do it with the contract to get it assignable. And how you get how you get the seller to agree to it is we may not close in the entity that we're signing this agreement in. It may be a different entity. However, if you get an assignable contract and you get to a point where you run out of money or somebody else wants to buy it right now, you can actually assign that contract and get paid and walk away from the deal like that. Right, Scott?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Absolutely. Same thing if you have a contract, purchase contract. Once we have an LOI, the reason you do LOI is because it's really simple for a seller, especially a simple seller, to go ahead and read through that and say, yeah, that's what we talked about. That's what we agreed to. Then you go ahead and do the FAR with your 3-page addendum or whatever. And we try to do that fairly shortly after the original thing. And then that just, basically says the terms in all the legalese stuff. Because
has any money transferred with the LOI?
No, not usually.
Okay. That's good. That's a good point, guys. There's no money transfer. Is it still a binding contract?
No, it's not usually a binding contract.
There
It'll
you go.
even say in there that it's not binding upon the parties until fully mutually agreed upon purchase and sale agreements, mutually agreed upon and signed.
All right. And then we have the purchase and sale.
Yeah, so the purchase and sale is basically an extension of the LOI. In almost every case of what we do, it's an option contract. It's they have to perform if we decide that we want to buy it, they have to sell it. So in all our contracts, we have the right of specific performance that the seller has to. If not, we can sue them to close. So it's just an option. So that we're going to work on getting it zoned in 3 months or 6 months or whatever that time frame is. We're not risking any money. And typically what we do in the purchase and sale agreement and in the LOI is that any of the work product that we do, if we terminate our agreement, we give them the work product. In a lot of the cases of stuff that we do, we have to go get the survey and pay for the survey. That's part of that 20, 25 grand that I was talking about a while ago. Is a lot of these sellers, especially if they bought a property 30 years ago or whenever, or they got it inherited, whatever, it's been in the family for 20 or 30 years. The majority of those people have never spent $1 on the property other than paying the taxes. And so, or maybe putting a fence around it and a gate or something like that. But I mean, they haven't really done anything. So they've never gotten a survey. So we always get the survey. And what we say is part of the reason we only want to do, Mr. Butler, give you 5,000 down is we're going to spend 20 grand here during this due diligence period, or 25 grand. And that if we terminate the agreement, we'll just hand you all of that with no bills. It's, we'll have paid for it. And that's basically the rest of the consideration for this option agreement.
Yeah, and the idea is that the survey isn't going to do you any good. You're not going to do the project now, so you might as well give it to them. It's already paid for. And a lease with an option to buy is usually not used, but they're out there. If you wanted to lease in the real estate world, there's a thing called a lease with an option to buy. You can do that in certain situations where you're renting the property. You have an option to buy that property, still a unilateral contract, but the seller's getting something down and he's getting something per month, and he may be more happy with that than just an option contract.
We talked about that briefly last week. I had an opportunity because some of these old farmer guys were cash poor but land rich. So you could pay them, let's say, $10,000 a month. That was we call hot or hard, was released to them, and in consideration for that, they would give you 2 years or maybe an extraordinarily long period of time to get something approved. You're going to spend the money anyway. And my thought was is on some of those, when I knew that I could get it permitted, I didn't necessarily mind spending 10 grand a month to comfortably have all the time that I needed and everything else without a seller worrying about it. And we just cut them a check every month and moved on. If you look at that over an 18-month period, it's only 180 grand, which on a bigger piece of property, you may spend that money in deposit anyway. So right. Again, the next little thing here is anything you and the seller can agree on. And that's kind of one of those, your price, my terms type deal. Oh, Mr. Butler will agree to pay you $20,000 an acre, but here's what we want to do. We want to give you $10,000 a month for the next 18 months, and then we'll close for cash. And, then they go, oh, that's great. And then, you think it's worth $50,000 an acre, you're going to flip it or whatever, or develop it and, put the 30 grand in your pocket as part of your equity to develop. So
yeah,
a lot of these
also Scott, back with the when you're developing when you're writing and strategizing contracts, if it's a large parcel, you can have 5 acres or 10 acres released with a so much money, I get this much property. What do you call that kind of a contract?
That's just an option with a partial release.
Partial release.
That usually happens with seller financing. So I may be working, you may be selling like me 40 acres and I'm going to start with 5 acres and I'm going to kind of work through it. And we agree on a general, what's first, and what's second, and what's third, or whatever. Maybe it's in three takedowns or whatever. You're going to hold seller financing. So in that kind of case, you would, when we paid you for that, you would release that from the mortgage.
All right, and then moving right along here, we already talked about putting all your agreements in writing. The goal we've talked about, have as little money at risk as possible. Can you spend just a minute on ask or build extensions, and then we're going to have to kind of close it out at that point.
Yeah, so my Normandy deal was my 32 acres in Deltona was supposed to close in August. The 2 different groups that I had that were going to come in and close didn't close. So I was scrambling like the Mad Hatter, like no tomorrow. So I agreed at that point to put up more deposit money to extend the closing. And we just did it again. So I wrote a check, I wired a check on Monday for 20 grand to this one group, and my partner wired 35 so that we get an extension for 2 more weeks so that we could close this thing. But we didn't lose a deal. And we have a potential on this deal making $4 or $5 million worth of profit. And I was scrambling because I ran out of money. So a lot of times when that happens, you go to your friends, family, you beg, borrow, and steal whatever you can to get enough time so that you can get your deal done. It's not unusual. Sometimes in this case, I did a bunch of different extensions because I had multiple sellers and they all wanted different money. And some of them said, well, I'll give you the extension, but I need 20 grand. It's not going to get credited to the purchase price.
Oh my goodness.
They were like, give me 35,000. It will be credited to the purchase price. And one guy upped the price on me 300 grand and wanted it. I wanted the 50 that I had already given him released, and he wanted another 45,000 that was hot at that moment that we put it up. So, I mean, again, it goes back to anything you can agree on, and depending on what your deal is and how badly you want it or don't want it or whatever, I had already had over 100,000 up in deposits. I didn't want to walk from that.
Yeah,
so.
And it's a good idea when you're writing the contract with that seller. He's the happiest he will ever be, usually at that point. And that's when you put in your extensions. You say, well, it's going to be 90 days, but with another 10,000 down, it'll extend for another 90 days. You put those extensions in there then, and now you're not going back like Scott was trying to do and scramble and get people to make extensions after you were supposed to already have closed.
Yeah. So again, you're only limited to your imagination. I mean, we've done some incredibly wild things on contracts, where we've given people even 10% of the profit at the end, after as a carried interest in a property. So because we couldn't get to their price, but we said, okay, we'll end up giving you more if you can wait a while or whatever. So.
Well, guys, we're going to have to kind of close it out. We're 15 minutes overtime here. This is just a big subject. There's a lot of things, a lot that can be done. We're going to go into probably, talking about cash. We're going to how to shorten down the time so you can mitigate your risk. And then we'll go into the letter of intent. We'll go into contracts. We'll go into option agreements. Potential red flags, risk evaluation and mitigation, and who knows where it's going to go from there. But, this is just, a big topic. It's an important topic for anybody that's going to do development. We want the time that you spend right now learning this stuff is going to save you tons and tons down the road, and scrambling and headaches and pulling your hair out, and that kind of thing. So, with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Leanne, let you close us out. Thanks again, Scott.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Again, if you need me, just send me an email.
Thank you, Scott. That was some really great info. We got some comments saying, fantastic. Thank you, Scott. Nancy said, thank you for all of the very valuable information. Really enjoyed this session. So that's good to see. People are getting something out of this. I know it's a
Thanks,
lot
I'm
of
glad to-
info. Yeah, thanks for taking time out of your busy day to help us out with this. And tomorrow night is Inspector Chat night. So if you're coming, bring some questions. I'm sure we'll have some topics, but we'll also be able to take your questions. So anything else, Robin? I think with that, we're pretty much good to go. So you
I think-
guys stay safe. I know some of you are here in Florida. Stay safe from Hurricane Nicole. And we'll see you tomorrow. Hasta mañana.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Have a good night. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.